You know that as your waist expands, your brain shrinks.
What?
Yeah, it's related to
Max Lugavere.
He's the author of the New York Times bestselling book, Genius Foods.
A brain food expert.
He's just the best in the world at what he does.
There's a lot of misinformation out there. And so my passion is to know what's true. So when it comes to sugar, your average adult today is consuming 77 grams of added sugar every single day. That's almost 20 teaspoons.
Jesus Christ.
But the issue is we're designed to overconsume those foods. So you're fighting against millions of years of evolution.
How do we solve that?
I haven't gotten asked that anywhere else. So
controversial new research surrounding meat in our diet.
Red meat is not associated with the health problems we've been told for decades. People will try to censor you in talking about it, but we know that animal products in particular contain nutrients that are very supportive of good mental health. And there have been a number of studies that have shown that particularly vegan diets put people at increased risk for depression, at least a doubling of risk. I mean, food is so powerful. It's medicine. I get passionate about this because my mom was a vegetarian. It's clear that her low meat diet didn't protect her. There was a period where she got really bad really fast, and then she passed away. It was just so incredibly hard. There were times I thought about suicide. It really showed me how fragile life is. We have incredible agency to change our destiny and to change the way, really, ultimately, most of us are aging today.
So how do we change that? Max, why do you do what you do, and what do you do?
Oh man, what a place to start. I do what I do because the most important person in my life, my mother, was very ill from a very young age, and that was the most traumatic. Seeing her go through what she went through was the most traumatic thing I've ever had to endure in my life, and ultimately it led to me losing her. And when a loved one gets sick, you know, had I struggled with any kind of like health condition, it probably wouldn't have been the motivating force in my life that that my mom was for me. But because it was my mom, because it was somebody who really was such a beautiful person and who aspired her whole life to be healthy, seeing her succumb to illness, it was a call to action to me to learn as much as I possibly could about health and nutrition, and to share that knowledge as I was acquiring it with ultimately anybody who would listen. And so what I do is I consider myself a health and science journalist with a point of view, I suppose. I'm a filmmaker, I'm a podcaster, I'm an author, but ultimately my mission in life, I think my purpose in life is to help people feel better, live longer, live healthier, and to avert ultimately the kinds of conditions that my mom struggled with for so many years.
Zooming in on that then, can you take me to the day that you found out your mum was sick? And what was there a phone call? Were you at the doctor's with her? And what was the diagnosis?
It was around the year 2011. She was 58 roughly at the time. And I had been living in Los Angeles and my mother was home in New York City. And I would routinely check in with my mom on the phone. And at a certain point, she started to complain to me about brain fog. And I thought, you know, that was was par for the course of getting older. It's not a term that was in my lexicon, but, you know, brain fog, you kind of have a sense of what someone's talking about when they say that. I started to spend more and more time in New York. I was actually in between jobs at the time. And because of that, and because my mom's symptoms seemed to be a little bit worse than just like, you know, some passing phase, I started going with her to doctor's appointments. And nobody could give us answers. And I'm from, as I mentioned, New York City. And so we have access in New York to cathedrals, to academic medical insight, right? And so in all of those instances, I was just met with a total lack of clarity. And it was really frustrating for me and my family. one physician would think that it was depression, for example, and prescribe my mom a non, like an SSRI drug, which are so commonly taken these days. But her symptoms continued to get worse, and ultimately we had to take a trip to the Cleveland Clinic. So in the United States, the two, I guess, highest regarded hospitals in the country are the Mayo Clinic and the Cleveland Clinic. I mean, there are probably others in that tier as well, but the reason why we felt the need to travel to the Cleveland Clinic was because they're known for taking on very complex medical cases. And so we took out a couple nights at a Holiday Inn across the street from a hotel, and we show up at the hospital. They assemble a team around the patient, and it was there that week that my mom was diagnosed for the first time with a neurodegenerative condition. The diagnosis was unclear, but she was prescribed drugs for both Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease at the same time. And so not knowing anything about either of those conditions, I mean, what I did know about those conditions were misconceptions. And, some of them were, for example, that they're old person's conditions, that they are, somehow genetically predetermined. But doing what any millennial with a data plan would do, I went home and I went back to the hotel and I sat on the couch in the suite and I started Googling Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, because those were the indications for the drugs that my mom was given. And that was the first time in my life that I'd ever had a panic attack. Like I felt short of breath. I felt the room starting to close in on me. And it was, that was a real turning point in my life, learning that my mom had an incurable progressive condition. And that was the point at which I really it wasn't even a choice. I couldn't focus on anything but trying to understand to the best of my ability why this happened to my mom. And I'm not a medical doctor. I didn't take an academic route. I didn't, get a PhD, but I had always been passionate about health and nutrition and fitness and exercise science. I actually started college on a pre-med track. And I'm not saying that is could ever be a replacement for the rigors of, going through the academic channels, but I knew where to find research because I had worked as a journalist after college. And so what I did was I just immediately dove into the medical literature, and it was really difficult to understand at first, but it's something that you read and you read and you read and you cross-reference and you watch, you read books, you watch TED Talks. I left no stone unturned. I was that first year, I wasn't even sleeping. I was just trying to read anything I could get my hands on. And then ultimately that search broadened out where I started reaching out to experts, like actual scientists who are now ushering in the concept of dementia as a preventable condition. And I started asking them questions. And so, yeah, that was a journey that began about 10 years ago. But it was really motivated by that sort of initial incident where my mom was first diagnosed. And it continued to, watching my mom decline over the following years was really, it was just so incredibly hard that it just further cemented my mission, to try to understand all that I could about these conditions. Because by the time you show up to your doctor's office, a lot of people ask, why me, right? It seems like these diagnoses are something that that the condition that we're being diagnosed for happened overnight, right? But it's not. Most of these conditions, the kinds of conditions that are now saddling modern society, take years, if not decades, to develop. And so, to me, what that suggests is we have incredible agency to change our destiny and to change the way, really, ultimately, most of us are aging today. And so I became obsessed, and I still am. So
let's talk about Genius Foods then.
Yeah.
Chapter 3 of this book, you talk about sugar.
Yes.
Sugar is something I've thought a lot about recently. I'm on a bit of a food journey myself, trying to correct a lot of things in my diet. And to be honest, I find it all absolutely intimidating, contradictory, to the point that I'm not sure where I feel like I'm being pulled and pushed from pillar to post. So I'm very keen to try and simplify my understanding of some of these sort of basic nutritional concepts. Sugar. I'm going to ask you if it's good or bad, and I'm asking that because I'm a Neanderthal and I just want things, a lot of my questions on this subject matter will be very simplified, and hopefully whoever's listening to this at home shares an equally primitive brain so I can be a bridge to them. But sugar, good or bad?
It depends.
I knew you were going to say that, and I knew it was a stupid question.
Well, that's the kind of answer that you should expect from somebody who really knows what they're talking about. The biggest problem, I think, today with regard to sugar is added sugar. So it's not sugar that's naturally found in food. All plant foods have some quantity of sugar. Even kale has a tiny amount of sugar. Mostly, you'll find it most concentrated in fruit, obviously, which is like the primary source of naturally occurring sugar in the produce section of the supermarket in whole fruit. But the most pernicious source of sugar today is the added sugar. The sugar that is added by food manufacturers to ultra-processed foods, usually with the intent of making those foods hyper-palatable. Basically, these foods, one of the major problems with most ultra-processed foods is that they push your brain to a bliss point beyond which self-control becomes really difficult, if not altogether impossible.
I can relate.
Yeah, it's like the pint of ice cream, right? We've all had that experience of going over to the freezer, breaking out the pint of ice cream, flipping the top, taking a spoonful, only intending on having that spoonful. And then before you know it, you're looking at the bottom of the pint, right? I've been there. Everybody I know has been there. It's just, the problem is that people tend to think that it's a moral failure, right? That they screwed up when they're unable to moderate their consumption of those kinds of foods, whether it's ice cream or cupcakes or cookies or what have you. But the issue is, the real understanding here is that it's not a moral failure. We're designed to overconsume those foods because they light up fireworks in our brain's reward centers because they're so calorie dense. And now we live in a time where we've solved for the food scarcity problem, right? We have food overabundance. This is the first time in human history where there are more overweight people walking the planet than underweight people. So we've solved that issue. But our brains, I mean, they're still operating on version 1.0 of the operating system that told them that when we encountered sweet foods, or even savory foods for that matter, because salt is actually a very valuable nutrient as well, that we shouldn't stop consuming them because we don't know when the next feast is going to be, right? It was like there were periods of feast and famine. And so our brains and ultimately our palates and our willpower are doing exactly what they're programmed to do. So you're fighting against millennia, you're fighting against millions of years of evolution when you try to moderate your consumption of those foods. And I think that's the real problem with added sugar. We tend to overconsume it. We don't tire of eating it. It gives foods this quality of being hyper-palatable. And it also has a number of, inconvenient, let's just say, hormonal effects that when we really go overboard, aren't doing our health any favors. But for your average person today, I mean, we live in a world where, at least here in the United States, 1 in 2 people is trending towards obesity. Not just being overweight, but like obese, 1 in 2. So out of every other person, that person has clinical obesity. And 1 in 2 people also have some degree of glucose dysregulation. And glucose is essentially sugar. So for your average person, for most people today have some degree of metabolic dysfunction. The vast majority, in fact, do. And so for that person, sugar really is something, added sugar in particular, is something that really ought to be minimized, if not altogether avoided. Now, a little bit here and there, it's not going to be a problem. No single food can sway your health in any one direction, both either towards health or towards disease. But it's really, I think, important to be mindful of all of the many different places of added sugar in the modern food supply. The other problem, which isn't necessarily a health problem, but it's a problem with regard to dose, because as I mentioned, dose makes the poison. One of the biggest issues with added sugar is that it's our consumption of it is insidious, meaning it's just hidden everywhere. Whether it's commercial bread products or sauces or sugar-sweetened coffee drinks, we tend to just consume a ton of it. Your average adult today is consuming something like 77 grams of added sugar every single day. If you want to just visualize that, that's almost 20 teaspoons of pure sugar.
Jesus Christ.
20 teaspoons of pure sugar. This is sugar extracted from the food matrix. So this isn't sugar in fruit. This is just the added sugar that we're consuming by way of these food-like products that Americans and Brits and people, increasingly around the world in developed societies are over-consuming today.
When I see, fizzy drinks that say they don't have sugar in them, or other things that say they're sugar-free, should I be skeptical? Because some of these things I'm eating this chocolate bar and I'm thinking this is too good. It says sugar-free or like really low sugar, but it just tastes like heaven.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I haven't gotten asked that anywhere else. It's definitely worth talking about. So a lot of like sugar-free products today will use, there's a number of ways to make a product palatable and still say that there's no added sugar. So one way is manufacturers will use a compound called maltodextrin, which is essentially sugar. It's very sweet. It's technically a complex carbohydrate, so they don't have to list it as sugar, but it breaks down almost immediately into pure glucose. So it's actually a glucose polymer. So it's like molecules of glucose bound together in a way that's very easy for the body to break down. Other ways, they'll add fake fibers like chicory root fiber or tapioca starch fiber. The FDA is currently investigating whether or not these fibers, because the whole point of fiber is that we don't digest it. It's something that passes through us, maybe gets fermented by gut microbiota in our large intestine. But it's unclear as to whether or not these purported fibers actually act like fiber once in our bodies. And so overconsumption of those fibers can cause all kinds of digestive upset. A lot of people will get like incredibly bloated, like all kinds of inconvenient digestive issues when they overconsume them. And you'll see those a lot in like sugar-free products. Then you've got artificial sweeteners. You've got other non-caloric sweeteners like stevia, monk fruit. There are sugar alcohols, which sugar alcohols are an umbrella category. And underneath that umbrella, you've got sugar alcohols that I think are pretty good, actually, like erythritol and xylitol. And then you have others like maltitol and sorbitol, where if you overconsume those, again, more digestive upset. So you just really want to be careful with the non-caloric sweeteners that you're ingesting, making sure ultimately that you're not ingesting too much, particularly of like these fake fibers and some of the artificial or some of the, the sugar alcohols, because they can really wreck your gut.
What's your personal sort of diet regime as it relates to sugar? Do you have sugar in your diet?
Not a ton, to be honest. I try to minimize my consumption of ultra processed foods, which are, I can define that if you want, because it's a term that I feel like I use a lot these days. And, people, I tend to use it as if everybody knows what I'm talking about. But essentially, you have unprocessed food, which is like what you'll find around the perimeter of your supermarket, right? Meat, fish, eggs, vegetables, fruit. Then you have minimally processed food. So ground beef, for example, has been minimally processed, right? When you cook that beef, you're essentially processing beef, right? You're processing food when you cook it. A fruit smoothie is essentially processed fruit, because you're taking some of the steps away with regard to the assimilation process, right? With a fruit smoothie, you no longer have to chew fruit. You now suddenly get to drink your fruit. Ultra processed foods, and you could do all of those, by the way, in your kitchen. So that's the distinction. Ultra processed foods are foods that you couldn't possibly make in your own kitchen. They tend to be shelf stable. They tend to, so you tend to find them in the aisles of our supermarkets. They have long shelf lives. They come in packages. They tend to have long ingredients lists, oftentimes with ingredients that you don't recognize. So that right there is a key. Some people listening to this might say, oh, well, that's a naturalistic fallacy. Not everything that we can pronounce is good for us, and not everything that we can't pronounce is bad for us, right? I think that's a pretty poor argument. I actually think that it's reasonable in a time where 60% of the calories your average person is consuming is coming from these ultra processed foods. And we know that people are metabolically unwell. And we know also that like the food industry has lied to us so many times in the past as they continue to put profit over, consumer health and well-being, I think it's totally reasonable to want to know what's in your food. So if you can't identify and therefore recreate the product in question, chances are it's an ultra-processed food product.
I was going to ask the question then, are all ultra-processed foods bad?
Great question. So I would say that as a screening tool, ultra-processed foods, you generally want to avoid them. As a diagnostic tool, are individual food products that happen to be ultra-processed necessarily bad by virtue of their processing? Not all the time. And some examples of some ultra-processed foods that I think are actually quite good, although, again, they are in the minority, would be, for example, like whey protein. You couldn't make whey protein, or most of us couldn't make whey protein in our kitchens, right? Fat-free plain Greek yogurt, I think, is a great high-protein, low-cost, low-calorie food. You generally couldn't make that in your kitchen. Like you would, you could if you really wanted to put in the time and effort. Dark chocolate is something that tends to be made in a plant, right? But we know that there are significant benefits to the consumption of dark chocolate. I think food manufacturers are becoming wise to this, and so now you'll find various high protein options that are shelf stable and the like. And it really has to be determined on a case by case basis. Mm-hmm. But just in general, ultra processed foods are a big problem because they tend to be not the best for us. Like the majority of ultra processed foods that people are consuming are refined grain products packed with added sugar, excess sodium. Sodium's not bad, but we tend to overconsume it today because of its presence in these ultra processed products used as a flavor enhancer. So most ultra processed products are bad, and it's sort of like the analogy that I'll draw. It's sort of like the BMI. I don't know if you're familiar with the BMI, but BMI is a way that it's a screening tool for obesity. So when you look at the population level, most people with a certain BMI past a certain level are either obese or severely obese. And it's a screening tool. It's not a tool that any physician would use to diagnose obesity because you have to look specifically at a person's body composition. You hear stories all the time like The Rock being technically obese, right? That's why BMI is not a good diagnostic tool, but it is a fairly trustworthy screening tool. So similarly, ultra processed foods, there are definitely some exceptions, but in general, they're a food category to be minimized.
I've been I'm just off the back of trying to have a ketogenic diet. I tried for about 2 months.
Yeah.
Went well in terms of the superficial results I think I was seeking. Felt great as well in terms of my focus, my performance. I just felt really good. I felt lighter. The digestive challenges I was having and the pains and the bloating had completely vanished for those 2 months. But I couldn't stick at it. For maybe I have fragile willpower or something. But and then I had 2 guests come on my podcast who talked about the ketogenic diet, and they both alluded to the fact that the issue with it is your human's ability to stick to the thing.
Yeah.
What's your position on the ketogenic diet? And I know in your book, I think chapter 11, you talk a little bit about you seem very pro ketogenic diet.
Yeah, I'm pro the ketogenic diet in certain contexts.
Okay.
I'm not necessarily pro the ketogenic diet in every context. You don't need to be on a ketogenic diet for weight loss. I think that's a big misconception. But the reason why I talk about it, you have to understand the context of the ketogenic diet within Genius Foods, which is that from the standpoint of the brain, it's a very important diet. It's an important diet to study. It's an important diet to talk about. As I've mentioned, we've been using it to treat certain types of epilepsy for 100 years at this point. And that's because it's the only diet that changes the biochemistry of the brain. It does that in a very significant way. It provides an alternate fuel substrate to the brain, which normally relies on glucose. But in certain situations, the brain can't rely on glucose. For example, with traumatic brain injury, or certainly in the setting of Alzheimer's disease, where the brain's ability to generate ATP from glucose, ATP is the brain's primary energetic currency, is diminished by about 50%. And so, if you're able to essentially keep the lights on, so to speak, by providing the brain with this alternate fuel source, then that's a really powerful idea and needs to be studied. And there have been a number of studies on, in the setting of Alzheimer's disease that have shown that, at least in the short term, the ketogenic diet seems to provide some degree of symptom improvement, which I think is really important. Now, does that mean that the ketogenic diet is going to be right for every dementia patient? Certainly not, because it is an incredibly hard diet to adhere to, and particularly for somebody with dementia. I mean, putting somebody with dementia on any kind of diet outside of the diet that they're used to is virtually impossible, right? But in Alzheimer's disease specifically, patients with Alzheimer's disease will actually start to develop a sweet tooth, and it's thought that that's in part the brain, a response to the brain crying out for energy, because its ability to create energy, again, from sugar is diminished by 50%. And so getting somebody, with dementia to adhere to that diet, it's just really difficult to do. But if we can, if for example, the reader of my book, were to one day have some kind of neurological condition and want to experiment with that, then that's a great thing. We also have various ketogenic therapies, like whether it's MCT oil or powder or these exogenous ketone supplements. I know people tend to roll their eyes and think that these are like a fad now, but there's actually an FDA-approved medical food on the market for the treatment of dementia called Axona, which is basically based on these medium-chain triglycerides. So this is like real science. There's now lots of evidence suggesting that ketogenic diets can be useful in the setting of various types of mental illness. So yeah, I mean, I just think it's so crucially important to talk about. Now, does your average person need to be on a ketogenic diet for good health? No. Does the average person need to be on a ketogenic diet to prevent dementia? No. Similarly, it's the same thing with like for type 2 diabetes, which is now super common. It's not that sugar in the diet caused type 2 diabetes. It's the overconsumption of calories and the like, and it's the overfilling. I mean, that's a whole different rabbit hole, but the overfilling of a person's fat silos that then causes fat to accumulate in other organ tissues. And so carbohydrates are part of that problem, but does that mean that carbohydrates caused the issue? Not necessarily. However, for somebody with type 2 diabetes who essentially has gotten to a point of glucose intolerance, yeah, being on a low-carb diet might actually be a good therapeutic option. It's not fixing the issue, so to speak, but that's the same. I would say that's the analogy that I would draw to the ketogenic diet. It's a powerful therapeutic diet, and and we have to keep talking about it. There's a lot of people that will that will try to censor you in talking about it now from the vegan camp, like the people who advocate for these plant-based diets, because the ketogenic diet tends to be a diet that is inclusive of animal products. In some iterations of it, it might even be a high animal product diet, right? But they're just like against it because it includes animal products. But if you're talking about neurology and you're not also talking about the ketogenic diet, then you're doing a massive disservice to patients, I think, around the world.
On that point of vegans, vegetarians, vegans, one of the things you've said is that you think they're putting themselves at increased risk of mental health problems and dementia because some of the important chemicals to avert those diseases are found in animal products like fish and eggs and meat and stuff like that. Is that accurate?
Yeah, well, certainly, certainly eating fish is associated with reduced risk.
Dementia.
Yes.
Yeah.
But also now we're starting to see other forms of animal products like beef, chicken, dairy are associated with reduced risk of cognitive decline, We know that animal products are the richest source of choline, and we've seen that higher consumption of choline is associated with reduced risk of cognitive decline. There were, just over the past year, there have been a number of really important studies, generally observational in nature. That's kind of one of the issues with nutrition science. It's really, we have very few long-term, randomized controlled trials to show us with certainty that these connections are causal. But the UK Biobank study, which is a very large population, 500,000 people, observational study, found that a dose response, meaning the more, I believe, animal products were consumed, the lower the risk of dementia and Alzheimer's disease by a pretty significant margin. We see that red meat is not associated with the kinds of health problems that we've been told for decades.
Cancer and stuff. And
yeah, I mean, it's dietary quality as a whole. There was a great study people can look up. Maximova is the first author. I believe the year it was published was 2017 or 2018. They looked at all-cause cancer, and they found that when people were eating meat on a low-quality diet, meaning meat in the context of fast food, right? That, yeah, there was an increased risk for cancer. But once diet quality was high, meaning that people were eating meat with fresh fruits and vegetables, clearly a dietary pattern indicative of health consciousness, that risk of cancer was completely abolished. So yeah, early on in nutrition, I think it was, with poor quality studies.
Sponsored by people that have a dog in the fight.
Yeah, exactly. It's very easy to zoom out at the population level and to see links drawn between meat consumption and anything bad imaginable, right? Because most of the time, first of all, most people who consume more meat, especially in this country, tend to be more sedentary and they tend to smoke more. This is the whole concept of healthy user bias, which is so crucially important. You have to know, if you intend to know anything about nutrition, you have to know about healthy user bias. People who eat more red meat, they tend to smoke more, they tend to be more sedentary, they tend to eat more fast food. Like most meat products consumed in this country are hamburgers. They're chicken nuggets, they're those kinds of foods, ultra processed meat products. Conversely, if you look at the consumption of fresh fruits and vegetables, you see healthy user bias there too, favoring fresh fruits and vegetables. And that's, it's pretty obvious to understand why. Most people today are obese. They're consuming ultra processed foods day and night, fast food, shelf stable convenience foods, the kinds of foods foods in quotes that you would get from a vending machine, for example. Those are the foods that are the base of most people's food pyramids, so to speak. And so if you were to take a food like quinoa, for example, which, first of all, if you know how to pronounce quinoa, you're probably reading health blogs, right? You've probably listened to a health podcast or two, right? Consumption of quinoa is probably associated. I don't know if this study has been done, but I would bet $500 today that consumption of quinoa is associated with robust health. Is it because the quinoa is so healthy, or is it because the person that's eating quinoa on a regular basis, that person's probably a pretty health conscious person? That person probably shops at Whole Foods. That person probably has a gym membership, so that's healthy user bias right there. And so it works in the inverse sort of way with red meat. There are very few health conscious red meat eaters. I mean, there are more now, but we're sort of a niche, we're people on the paleo diet, so to speak. Most people who consume red meat, yeah, they're eating it in the form of hot dogs and hamburgers and Subway sandwiches with the fries, with the large Coke. So all that is to say is that it's very easy to find links. And that's why there's this funny truism in nutrition science, is that if you look in the nutrition literature, you can find a study to back up anything that you want to say. I'm always hyper conscious of that. But that's certainly the case with meat because these observational studies, they're so difficult to do. But now newer studies are showing us that when you control for these kinds of things like diet quality, that there's no association. That meat actually is a very nutritious food. And with the small slew of randomized control trials that we have with regard to red meat, we see no negative impact with regard to an actual like real clinical outcome. And oftentimes we see benefit because it's a pristine, wonderful source of protein. It's a wonderful source of many micronutrients that we know people tend to underconsume today. Nutrients of concern, so to speak, like zinc, vitamin B12, nutrients that we know that people direly need, iron. Iron deficiency anemia is a real global problem. 1 in 4 people globally are anemic, and half of those cases are due to iron deficiency. And red meat is like the ultimate iron supplement, you know? So, yeah, so I get passionate about this, I think in part because my mom was a vegetarian. And there were many times as I was, reading about all this stuff that I wanted to like shake my mom and be like, Mom, you're letting your ideology impact your biology. That's like not something that you want to happen. And I would never go so far as to say that I know what caused my mom's illness. Like, I don't even know if it was her lack of consuming meat. I don't know. But it's clear that her, low meat diet didn't protect her, and I'm pretty convinced at this point that that some is certainly better than none. It doesn't, I don't advocate. I think some people think that I advocate for a high meat diet or even like a carnivore diet. I don't. I really think it's an important part of a balanced diet, and a highly nutritious part of a diet. It's actually like red meat and animal products in general. They tend to be our most nutrient dense foods. There was a paper by Ty Beal, who's a nutrition researcher whose work I follow, that found that if you looked at the top 6 or so most nutrient-dense foods available to us, they're all animal products, with the exception of maybe dark leafy greens, which are also very nutrient-dense. So, yeah, I'm pretty unapologetic in my endorsement of animal products. Yeah.
Speaking of dark leafy greens and animal products and such, in your book on page 301, you talk about clearing out your kitchen. Now, I'm well aware when I asked this question that if you were clearing out my kitchen, you'd first throw out all of the ultra processed foods.
Probably, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I'd want you to do whatever's in my best interest.
I'd be gentle.
Okay. Next, all sources of wheat and gluten is point number 2.
Yeah.
All sources of gluten. That's all my bread gone.
Yeah. Well,
my noodles are going to go as well.
I think that my stance has softened a little bit since I wrote that.
I like the savage. Let's keep it moving.
Yeah.
Sources of industrial grade emulsifiers. What is an industrial grade emulsifier and why has it got to go?
Yeah. So specifically in the book, we call out polysorbate 80 and carboxymethylcellulose, which are synthetic emulsifiers that are used to create pleasing mouthfeels in foods, usually combine hydrophilic and hydrophobic substances, so oil and water, or fatty substances and a more aqueous solution. And so the archetypes of those foods would be nut milks and ice creams. And what they've shown in animal models, to be clear,
salad dressings and stuff as well.
Yeah, salad dressings. What they've shown in animal models is that those substances degrade the mucosa, this like really important lining that separates the inner contents of our GI tract from our gut epithelial cells, which, there's a chapter in Genius Foods that I'm very proud of on the gut microbiome, all the new science surrounding the gut microbiome and how, the gut-brain axis really in many ways influences not just brain function, but might have an effect on our predilection to disease. And so anything that inflames the gut isn't like Vegas. Like what happens in the gut doesn't necessarily stay in the gut. And so these 2 compounds were shown in animal models to have a profound inflammatory effect on the gut. And so I recommend looking out for them and avoiding them. Now, they're also a sort of a proxy or surrogate, if you will, for ultra-processed foods. Like ultra-processed foods are going to have those 2 compounds in them as opposed to fresh foods. So the dose makes the poison. But yeah, I would recommend avoiding them, because that study was like pretty eye-opening. And the consumption of those two compounds, I would say probably worth, avoiding.
I'm looking at this list of stuff that you've asked me to check out my kitchen, and there's a lot of things here that are currently in my kitchen. Beverages, fruit juice. Been a big fruit juice drinker my whole life. When I was younger, they told me that orange juice was healthy. I was guzzling orange juice, thinking I was doing my body a huge service in doing so. And then over time, I've come to learn from having conversations like this that these fruit juices, I thought when I had like a fruit smoothie, I thought I was like, I was paying homage to my body. But I've come to learn that I was probably doing my body a disservice in many respects because of the sugar, the available sugar content.
I mean, you can squeeze the fruit sugar from 5-6 oranges in one glass of orange juice. I mean, think about it. The last time you ate a whole apple, did you feel afterwards that you wanted to go and eat another apple?
No, I mean, I only ever eat one apple at a time.
There you go.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I think the reason for that is probably that whole fruit is self-limiting, because
it fills you a bit more than
it fills you a bit more. Yeah. First of all, you're eating it. There's a speed at which you're eating it that's a lot slower than when you drink the fruit juice. So it takes a lot, it allows your body, your stomach to realize that it now has food in it to turn off some of those hunger signals like the hormone ghrelin. You also, when you chew it, you leave large particles of the apple that might take, an hour to fully digest. The food matrix has fiber in it, like the fiber from that apple. So it slows the transit of that sugar. It slows it blunts basically the blood sugar spike. You're also getting lots of water along with the sugar that you're consuming when you consume that apple. It's a lot different when you're just drinking juice. It's a lot easier to get the fruit sugar from, if you're drinking apple juice, for example, you can easily drink the sugar of 5-6 apples in one glass. But, after eating even the most delicious Honeycrisp apple, which I love, it's like one of my favorite foods, I've never felt the need to go and get another one the way that when I'm eating tortilla chips, while I'm chewing on one tortilla chip, I'm already, lusting after the one that's in my hands, right? I'm not even focused on the one that's in my mouth. And so,
why is that? I'm like that with so many foods. Like if I have one Pringle, it's going to take a lot to stop me getting to the bottom.
Yeah.
And I don't know why. It's like suddenly I become a Pringle addict. And I've always wondered why that is, because, Brussels sprouts, broccoli, I have one, I have two, I have three. Okay, we're done.
Yeah.
But the Pringles, I'll get to the bottom. Unless I'm in a social situation where I feel slightly embarrassed by eating an entire tube of Pringles.
Well, it's Pringles. Once you pop, you can't stop. That is a truism with scientific backing. We know that Pringles are ultra processed. We know that they're minimally satiating. There are 3 characteristics that make a food satiating, and Pringles lack all of them. So one is protein. Protein is the most satiating of the macronutrients. So for anybody struggling with hunger, pangs, or whatever, prioritize protein in your diet. Increase the amount of protein that you're consuming. For a person with healthy kidneys, there is absolutely nothing to worry about with regard to high protein consumption. It's the most satiating macronutrient, and it is a really important macronutrient for nourishing our musculature, and ultimately assuaging our hunger. When you eat more protein, you eat less carbs and fat, and carbs and fat are energy. Protein it's very difficult for your body to store protein. Your body doesn't want to store. There's so many uses for protein in your body, whether it's to create neurotransmitters or to rebuild your muscle tissue or your bones or ligaments, to create enzymes. I mean, protein has so many roles in the body. Carbs and fat, for the most part, are just energy. I mean, there's no such thing as an essential carbohydrate. That's not to say that carbohydrates are bad, by the way, because a lot of people will hear that and say, "Oh, I could get by on 0 carbohydrates." Carbohydrates are important for optimizing hormones, for optimizing exercise performance, but there's no such thing as an essential carbohydrate. It's essentially energy, and so too is fat. I mean, fat is energy as well. We have a minimal daily requirement for essential fats, and we see that higher fat can support energy, as I mentioned, you don't want to go low fat because fat supports hormone production. We see that people on low fat diets tend to have lower testosterone. It also facilitates the absorption of very important fat soluble nutrients like vitamins A, E, D, and K, and various fat soluble plant compounds. But it's carbohydrates and fat that are energy, very easily stored by the body. If we can easily store carbohydrates in our liver as sugar, glycogen, and in our musculature, and we can easily store fat in fat. So protein, very difficult to store. So that's the first factor that makes a food satiating. Pringles are a low protein food. The second factor is fiber. Pringles are largely devoid of fiber. Fiber slows, like we saw in the apple example, it slows the transit of food in the stomach. It makes us feel more satiated. It also absorbs water and it mechanically stretches out the stomach, which turns off certain hunger hormones like ghrelin, for example.
So good for weight loss.
Yeah, it's good for weight loss to prioritize protein and fiber, dietary fiber. And then water. So water is the number one enemy of shelf stability. And so ultra-processed foods, they want long shelf lives. That's like key to a profitable ultra-processed food product, right? It can be shipped overseas. It can stay for months on the shelf. Very little waste. And so products like Pringles, devoid of what, they're completely dehydrated, right? And water, sometimes when we're hungry, we're actually thirsty. It's just that those wires are getting sort of crossed and miscommunicated. But your average hunter-gatherer didn't have access to, running water. They couldn't just pop into their local gas station and buy bottled water. Where did a hunter-gatherer find water when it wasn't readily available? They would get it from food. They would get it from fruits and vegetables and even animal products are a good source of hydration. So oftentimes when we think that we're hungry, we just need a little bit of hydration. So all those three factors, the protein, the fiber, and the hydration, are all severely lacking in Pringles and other ultra-processed foods, not to call it specifically Pringles. But these kinds of foods that we now consume to our detriment today in the 21st century would have potentially saved the life of a hunter-gatherer, one of our ancestors, back prior to the ubiquity of food stability. So, yeah, not to hate on your Pringles addiction.
No, it's fine. They're out. Ladies and gentlemen, I am so excited to introduce and to announce that we have a brand new sponsor on this podcast. And it's a brand that I've used for the last decade across business, across personal life, when I'm holidaying, when I'm traveling for works, even at times when I haven't had somewhere to live, and that is Airbnb. The thing with Airbnb is most people, when they think about Airbnb, they think about the guest side of the product. They think about staying somewhere and scrolling through all of the incredible homes that you can stay in. But the entrepreneur in me has always thought about the other side, which is what space do I have? What space am I living in that I could add from a supply side and to create a revenue stream from? That's what I'm fascinated by. And I'll be sharing details about that side of Airbnb in the coming episodes. Thank you, Airbnb, for supporting us on this show. It means a lot. Reading through your work was the first time I encountered this distinction between health span and lifespan. In your own assessment, what is the difference between someone's health span and their lifespan?
Great question. So today we are living longer, right? Thanks to modern medical advances. Not all of us. My mom didn't have a lengthy lifespan, but generally we're living longer, but we are also dying longer. And what I mean by that is that our health spans are shrinking. So our lifespans are expanding, but we're actually spending more of our life, particularly in our latter years, sick, burdened with chronic disease and disability. And so I think it's really important that we not just have a lengthening of lifespan in our crosshairs, but that we also aspire to lengthen our health span. So we want to prevent chronic disease and disability to the best of our ability. And I think that's just crucially important. So what that implies is, as we age, that we continue to be mobile and to move about the world and to be free of depression, and we stay connected in our communities. And I think eating a healthy diet, exercising, staying socially connected. Averting loneliness, These are all crucially important. And yeah, unfortunately today, I think we tend to think only in terms of lifespan. I just want to live as long as possible. But, today for many people, particularly in the Western world, it's like it's a double-edged sword because you're living longer, but most people in elder age today are frail. They have chronic health conditions, and it's a big problem.
You mentioned depression there. I've been learning a little bit lately about the role that our diet plays in our mental health. You referenced earlier that your mother was given antidepressants, SSRIs, when she was going through her period of ill health. What's your assessment on the role that food plays in mental health? What foods are typically, in your view, good for our mental health, helping us to avoid depression, anxiety, whatever else, and what foods are typically bad for our mental health?
Oh man, yeah, mental health is so. I learned this recently, which is just shocking. That the number 2 cause of death for people between the ages of 15 and 35, in that sort of ballpark demographic, the second cause of death is suicide, and that's just shocking to me. The first is unintentional injury, so it's like drunk driving and just doing stupid things. But yeah, when it comes to mental health, I mean, our mental status is highly responsive to the outside, to our environment, and our environment includes how we're living our lives, the people that we surround ourselves with on a daily basis, and indeed the foods that we're eating. So, I think when it comes to mental health, there are a number of really interesting observational studies that show us that vegan and vegetarian diets, but I think particularly vegan diets, put people at increased risk for depression. By the latest data that I've seen, at least a doubling of risk. Now, the question that always arises there is the vegan dietary pattern causing the depression, or are people who are more prone to depression gravitating to the vegan diet? I think it's probably bidirectional, because we know that animal products in particular contain nutrients that seem to be very supportive of good mental health. There was one study out of Deakin University's Food and Mood Center that found that women who didn't consume the nationally recommended 3 to 4 servings of red meat per week were at twice the risk of developing major depression. And they didn't see that association for other animal proteins. So they didn't see it for chicken, pork. And they also saw an increased risk when women ate much more than that 3 to 4 serving recommendation. And when you actually look into what red meat contains in it, it contains a lot of nutrients that we know directly support the brain, whether it's zinc or vitamin B12. You could look at a food like beef liver, which is one of the best sources of folate. We know that low folate consumption is associated with depression. So I think I think animal products, super important. Eggs, a rich source of choline, fatty fish, but generally like whole foods. I think whole foods, a whole food dietary pattern. So, minimally processed, again, like the foods that you find around the perimeter of the supermarket that you cook for yourself.
Mediterranean diets.
Mediterranean style. Yeah. I don't care what proportion of animal products or plant products, you have, although I think including both to some degree is probably better than not, provided you're not allergic or have any specific sensitivity. But they're now using diet as an intervention to improve symptoms. So the same Food and Mood Center, which is actually one of the institutions that's really kind of championing this field of nutritional psychiatry, published the first ever randomized control trial where they used a dietary intervention to treat depression, major depression. So it was called the SMILES trial. And anybody can look this up, but they used a whole foods diet, Mediterranean style diet that was inclusive of red meat, fish, dark leafy greens, berries, olive oil, eggs, things like that. And they found that in the patients with major depression compared to controls that were treated with the standard of care, they saw something like a 3-fold increase in remission from the dietary intervention. Now, these were patients obviously that, or I guess not obviously, but they were patients that were on a junk food diet.
Right.
So if you're on a junk food diet, which most people are, and you're seeing, and your mood is not where you think it ought to be, I absolutely think a first line of defense should be, adopting more of these, or integrating rather more of these whole foods and cutting out the ultra processed foods. And then of course, I mean, like, sort of, you can't really talk about lifestyle and mental health without mentioning exercise. Exercise is, I mean, there's like a bounty of evidence at this point showing us that exercise is like literally medicine for the brain.
Saunas, something you talked about as well. Saunas having a positive impact on cognitive function via, I believe the chemical is called norepinephrine.
Norepinephrine, yeah.
That's what I said.
Or I believe on your side of the pond, it's called noradrenaline. It's the same thing.
Noradrenaline, okay.
Yeah, it's the same compound.
And that has a cognitive relationship, with cognitive performance?
Yeah, so norepinephrine is actually produced in a part of the brain called the locus ceruleus, which is like one of the first structures to become damaged in Alzheimer's disease. And so that's sort of like the hub of norepinephrine release. And we see that when we apply physical stress to the body, of which saunas are one type, that there's an upregulation of norepinephrine release. And yeah, so that might, in a way, sort of help, prime the body to adapt and become more resilient. Because that's essentially what stressors do to the body. That's the whole concept underlying hormesis. That hormesis, which is like low to moderate doses of a stressor, actually are as opposed to being, rather than being harmful to the body, actually elicit an adaptive response that makes the body come out on the other side stronger and more resilient. And so that is that's essentially the mechanism, the proposed mechanism underlying why it seems that saunas are beneficial to our health, but also exercise, and also cold water immersion, and also intermittent fasting, and also even some of these like plant compounds. Like we consume myriad compounds in plants that if we were to consume big doses might actually have a toxic effect, but in small doses actually are thought to benefit our health via this same hormetic pathway. But yeah, sauna use, a lot of the research is coming out of the University of Eastern Finland, which is a great place for this research to be done, because saunas in Finland are like taking a shower. So you could say, if those studies were being done here in the United States, you could easily write them off to healthy user bias, because somebody who's regularly saunaing is, or taking a sauna, as the Finns say, probably has access to a gym, probably is going to the spa regularly, probably is like putting a great deal of attention on their own physical health, right? But in Finland, that's not the case. People aren't doing saunas as like a health modality. They do it because they love it, because it's a salve to the to the cold temperatures there, and it's just a part of like the normal like routine. And so what they're finding is that you just using a sauna 2 to 3 times a week is associated with a 22% risk reduction for dementia. And using it 4 to 7 times per week is associated with a 65% reduced risk for the development of dementia. So that's like a dose response. The more you use it, the more robust the health effect seems to be. And it's not just for dementia. They've seen a reduced risk for hypertension, which we know is really important. We know that that blood pressure is really important from the standpoint of brain health. So you want to make sure that your blood pressure is healthy. Also, all-cause mortality. Now, just to be clear, these are still correlational studies, but mechanistically, there's plausibility there. And that is, we know that when you use a sauna, it does have a positive impact on your blood pressure. We know that it can reduce inflammation. We know that it gets your heart rate up. I mean, I know this. Whenever I use a sauna, I put my finger on the artery in my wrist, and I can see that I'm getting like almost like a mild aerobic workout. And so we know that saunas are essentially like the best workout that you can have while sitting absolutely still. You're also purging toxins through your sweat, compounds that aren't as effectively excreted via stool and urine. So it's like, there's a lot of good stuff going for saunas, and of course more research needs to be done. But all indicators seem to point towards a positive health effect.
It's really interesting that, our ancestors probably had natural stresses on them at all times. And we've kind of built a life around mitigating stresses. So, living in very warm, like room temperature, houses, sat on sofas, use this piece of glass to order my food, my date, to talk to my friends. It's almost like we're optimizing our lives away from stresses. And these stresses seem to be so critical to the natural hormone and physiological responses that make us healthy human beings.
Totally. Yeah. It's like, I've heard it referred to as like the comfort crisis.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a big problem, whether it's like constant climate control. Just like so few of us are willing at any point to venture out of our comfort zone and to be uncomfortable. And I think our biology suffers as a result. This isn't just, this is like there's actual now basic science underpinning this concept that when we apply stress to the body, or even via the foods that we consume, this like mild hormetic stress that we get from certain compounds, whether those compounds are in turmeric or kale or broccoli or what have you, that what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. And it fosters a degree of anti-fragility, which I love. I think it's so important. I mean, if you think about it, we didn't evolve over millennia to arrive here and be taken down by a peanut, or all of these, we're seeing this crazy spike in autoimmunity and incidence of autoimmune conditions and allergies and the like. And I think it's a testament to how dysregulated our lifestyles have become, how removed our lifestyles have become from the from the world in which we evolved. And part of what's been lost is the beneficial stress, as you've mentioned.
What is the unbeneficial stress and the impact it has? Chapter 10, you talk a lot about chronic stress. One of the things you said was, ever see a person with a bulging midsection but surprisingly skinny arms and legs? This is the picture of chronic stress.
Yeah, chronic stress is a killer. We evolved to see a threat, have a stress response, respond to that threat, and then go back to our baseline level of functioning, right? Today, our stressors come not from physical threat, right? From the lion on the savannah that's running towards us or towards our progeny. Where the stress that most of us experience today, it's a new breed of stress. It's from work. It's from chronic consumption of the news media. It's from being stuck in relationships that have gone sour, working jobs that we hate, financial stress. There's all different kinds of stress. And not all of that stress is avoidable, just to be clear. When I was going through what I went through with my mom, I couldn't avoid that stress. But what did I do as a way to cope? Because I couldn't avoid it, I built up my own resilience. And we see that, whether it's exercise or these hormetic stressors that we were talking about, that you actually can, by exposing your body to physical stress, you can bolster a degree of psychological stress. There's what's called a spillover effect. And a cross-adaptation effect that occurs. But chronic stress, one of the problems is that it's sustained and it causes a change in our hormonal milieu that suppresses immune function. It causes our adipocytes, so our fat cells, to release pro-inflammatory compounds, pro-inflammatory cytokines. It causes this, chronic release of the hormone cortisol, which is not a bad hormone by any means, but, that can over time have a negative effect on brain function, on memory function. It impairs digestion when we're chronically stressed. And we know that, the gut is crucially important when it comes to modulating inflammation in our bodies, helping us to assimilate nutrients from the foods that we're consuming. And if you're chronically stressed, you're just not doing that as well. Also, people who are chronically stressed, they have digestive symptoms, right? As a result, whether it's like diarrhea, bloating, this is people before public speaking, they often see, they often have digestive symptoms, right? That just goes to show you how intricately connected our our perception of like, stress and how that can affect our biology. And so that example that I gave in the book about that apple-shaped torso, one of the most harmful places to store fat in the body is in our midsection. So that apple-shaped body, that is attributable to an excess of visceral fat. And this is fat that essentially hugs our internal organs and is particularly pro-inflammatory. So it secretes, as I mentioned, we know that our fat is an endocrine organ, which is essentially an organ that secretes hormones. It's not just an inert storage site. And those fat cells have, I believe, 4 times the cortisol receptors as compared to regular run-of-the-mill subcutaneous fat that you store in your, underneath your arms and, on your thighs. And we know that visceral fat is associated with dramatically, worse cardiovascular health, increased risk of cardiovascular events. We know that as your waist expands, your brain shrinks. Yeah. Well, it's probably related to cortisol, because we know that cortisol causes that when cortisol is chronically elevated, and particularly when we then self-medicate with these ultra-processed foods that are high in sugar, right? Which we all reach for when we're stressed out, right? To emotional, to soothe ourselves, right? With food. We tend to store fat there, like in the midsection. So it's not that stress causes us to store more fat necessarily. I mean, fat storage is largely regulated by energy balance, but what it can do is dictate where we store that fat. And as I've mentioned, it's the storage of fat in our midsection that's particularly dangerous. And so, that the effect that cortisol can have there, it has a negative effect on other tissues. It can have a negative effect on our total brain volume, as we've seen in some studies.
Just to be clear, where does cortisol come from?
Our adrenal glands.
Adrenal glands.
Yeah.
And there's certain foods that stimulate the production of cortisol more than others?
Not foods. It's stress. And there are certain conditions that are associated with hypercortisolemia. But no, food, it's not food that it's not the foods. Foods actually can bring down cortisol, so some people like sugar, like sugary foods, like a lot of people, anecdotally at least, will see an improvement in their sleep when they consume a little bit of honey before bed, for example, because that can sort of bring down cortisol.
Right.
If they, for example, skipped dinner, or they had an earlier dinner, or they had a particularly low carb dinner, or maybe they're in a calorie deficit. So that can all cause cortisol to kind of inch its way up. And carbohydrates are good at sort of pumping the brake on cortisol release. That's one of the reasons why we tend to reach for sugary foods when we experience chronic stress. So it's like this vicious cycle, right? But the way to pump the brakes on cortisol release is not to just keep eating sugary foods. It's to find and uproot the cause of the stress. Get out of the job that you hate. Break up with the person who's driving you crazy on a chronic basis.
You mentioned honey there and sleep. Something, again, I've been thinking a lot about ever since I bought myself a Whoop, which tracks my sleep and gives me some data in the morning about how I slept, is how to improve my sleep via my diet. What advice would you give me there if I wanted to have deeper, more quality sleep? What should I be eating, not eating, avoiding, what times, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, generally, you want to not eat too close to bedtime. There's sort of a Goldilocks zone where, I think we're meant as diurnal creatures, meaning creatures that typically eat during the day. You want to eat your last meal about 2 to 3 hours before you go to sleep. You don't want to go to bed hungry. I mean, people obviously have different different preferences, and I think preference in many ways reigns supreme. But what we know from circadian biology is that we're meant to eat about 2 to 3 hours before we go to sleep, and you don't, that's to give space between your last meal and sleep, because sleep is a time for rebuilding and restoring. We see this interesting hormonal shift in the body that is really it's why sleep is, we rejuvenate in many ways, like our bodies, our cells, our tissues when sleeping. Part of like how we get there is a change in body temperature. And, we see this like this dip in body temperature right before we go to sleep, or just after actually we go to sleep. If you eat a really like meat heavy meal right before you go to sleep, a lot of people notice that doing that can negatively impair sleep. And I think one of the proposed mechanisms why that happens is that we have the thermic effect of protein is quite high, particularly compared to fat and carbohydrates. And so you've got this like internal furnace like burning in your gut, like to try to break down and assimilate all of the precious amino acids that you've just ingested. And so I think that can sometimes be at odds with like that wind down process, that circadian, wind down process. So yeah, I would try not to eat too close to bedtime. Many people feel like eating carbs before bed does help them sleep for that same reason. Like maybe they have cortisol, still like, a bit of cortisol dysregulation, and carbs before bed seems to be able to help with that.
When do you eat? If not before bed, like, sometimes I've been guilty of eating while I'm falling asleep. This is old Steve, not new Steve. But when do you eat? You talked about intermittent fasting. I read some things that said you start eating roughly at like 11 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
What's the window in which you eat?
I generally will, I generally won't have my first like food until, these days it's about 10:30, 11 in the morning. I've been experimenting with carbohydrates before exercise. For a long time, I really enjoyed fasted workouts. And lately I've been experimenting to see what a little bit of peri-workout carbohydrate does for my lifts, because I love fitness. So I've been kind of experimenting a bit with that. But the general rule of thumb that I practice is that I don't eat for an hour to an hour and a half after I wake up. Part of the reason for that is, and again, just to like preference, personal preference is really like key here. So, a lot of the like recommendations that I'll make, like you might see a smidgen of benefit, but at the end of the day, like if you can't, work out at the optimal time or, eat in the optimal windows, like, still what you eat and making sure that you are getting exercise is better than like not, because of like a fear that you're not doing it, optimally. Like exercise is crucially important. Eating a whole foods, animal inclusive, plant inclusive diet, I think optimal. But what circadian biology is showing us is that when you eat immediately after waking up, you might not have had your melatonin, for example, fully subside, which is a sleep hormone. When melatonin is elevated, as it starts to, rise once the sun begins to set, that sends the signal to our bodies essentially that the kitchen is closing, and that, we're now approaching the time where, we're going to change the guard. It's like a changing of the guard, essentially, where we're going to focus on rejuvenation and repair. When people wake up in the morning, that hormone hasn't fully necessarily subsided yet. And that can have the consequence of making us not as insulin sensitive. So it might impair glucose regulation while it's still elevated. And so like eating carbohydrates in that window, particularly like as they typically appear in the standard American diet, the bran muffin, the glass of orange juice, like that's, I don't think, like an appropriate breakfast for that time of day. You might be able to get by with something like that later on, but generally like after you wake up, you want your melatonin to fully subside, and also cortisol, which is your body's, we talked about that as a stress hormone. Cortisol is not bad. It's also your body's chief waking hormone. That's the highest that it's going to be throughout the day in the morning. And I mentioned that cortisol is catabolic. Well, one of the reasons why cortisol, like one of the effects that cortisol has is it helps to liberate stored fuels in the body, whether it's, sugar stored in your liver or even fat. People tend to wake up in a fat burning state. And so I like to just give my body like an hour and a half to like let my hormonal milieu adapt and get ready for food.
Do you go outside?
Yeah, as almost immediately after I wake up, I like open my blinds, so I have like a really big window. It allows like light to come in. You really want that morning light. It's crucially important. I've been a fan of Sachin Panda, his work for a long time. He's a circadian biologist down at the Salk Institute, and he's published a lot of great research. Actually, I think he helped to discover the melanopsin proteins in the eye that interface directly with this region in the brain. It's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. So it's like a switch gets set when we expose our eyes to bright morning light that essentially starts a 24-hour timer that influences our energy levels, our alertness, our coordination, our body temperature. And then at the end of the day, when we are, when we start to feel sleepy and when that sort of diurnal or nocturnal rather melatonin curve begins to pick up. So yeah, like setting your circadian rhythm first thing in the morning with bright light exposure is super important. Even on an overcast day, the ambient light is more than enough to flip that switch. So yeah, that's crucially important. My morning routine is essentially like I wake up, I open my blinds, I make sure that I'm, whether it's like, checking my phone or whatever it is, emails, like by the window so that I get that nice ambient bright light to anchor my body's circadian clock. And then generally like I wait an hour and I'll have like morning coffee, and then that's, when I'll like eat something. These days, it'll be a mixed meal with like protein and carbohydrates, and that's when I will typically hit the gym soon after that.
I've been asking everybody, you just mentioned coffee there, I've been asking everybody this question to try and figure out if someone can give me a new answer. But, coffee seems like this kind of miracle drug because everybody can point to the upsides of having coffee in the morning, whatever. But nobody has been able to really articulate to me the cost. And all these things in life have a cost, right? We live in a society now where many people will have multiple cups of coffee before 12 o'clock, before midday. And nobody seems to be able to tell me what the cost of that is. But there must be one because nothing in life is free.
Yeah.
So what is the cost?
Well, everybody's different. So, people metabolize. Some people are slow caffeine metabolizers. Others are not. And so, you really have to like determine for yourself whether or not coffee is something that works well for your body. It is a type of stress. I will say that. So for people who are chronically stressed, adding coffee to the mix is probably, just adding fuel to that fire. And it's not that I want you to get rid of the coffee. I'd rather see you get to the root cause of where that stress is coming from. But it can stimulate cortisol release, and it is a powerful stimulant. We know that. It can also negatively impact sleep. It actually affects your brain similarly to bright light. So that's why, for many reasons, you want to make sure that you are consuming it, far, far away from bedtime. But it honestly is hard to find a downside to coffee. I mean, there really is there is good research on it. Recently, it was discovered that the caffeine in coffee acts like a natural PCSK9 inhibitor. So I know that's like an unfamiliar, it's like a mouthful, but there's a new class of, I think, relatively, benign cholesterol lowering drugs on the market called PCSK9 inhibitors. Now, I'm not anti-cholesterol or anything like this. Some of our most healthful foods actually act like natural PCSK9 inhibitors. Dietary fiber, in a way, is like a PCSK9 inhibitor. But they found that high dose caffeine actually, at about a dose of about 400 milligrams, can actually act like this drug where it makes your liver more effective at recycling cholesterol carrying lipoproteins like LDL. And so that kind of like adds a mechanism to the observation that we've seen that people who regularly drink coffee seem to be protected against cardiovascular disease and even neurologic conditions like Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, and MS. So there seems to be this protective effect of coffee, but it's always important to caveat these findings with the fact that these are averages. So on average, coffee seems protective, but certainly within those cohorts that are being studied, some people are doing really poorly with coffee as well. So you just, it's something that you really have to like regularly take inventory and ask yourself, like, is this working, for me? I think one of the healthier ways to ingest coffee is to not consume it immediately after waking up, which, I'm guilty of doing many days, but like, it's generally something that's like, you're better off consuming like an hour or two after you wake up. And again, not too late into the afternoon, either. And like also, the dose I think is really important. People that develop caffeine dependency, they think that they're improving their performance with caffeine, but what they're really doing is they're treating their withdrawal from caffeine. So another way that I like to kind of make sure that I'm consuming it in the most mindful way possible is I'll take like occasional weeks off from caffeinated coffee and I'll switch to decaf. Yeah, and I feel like it sort of helps like resensitize my brain, breaks the dependency a little bit, and then I bring it back. And when you bring it back, man, you see what a drug, what a potent drug coffee really is, But in general, I'm a fan. I'm a fan of coffee. It's rich in polyphenols. It's a natural activator of our body's NRF2 pathway, which is like a detoxifying pathway in the body that's also stimulated by cruciferous vegetables.
Nobody can say anything bad about coffee. It's like everybody's part of the conglomerate and everyone's got like an affiliate link or they're on payroll or something. But
yeah.
So it's actually changed my perspective because I just assumed that anything that was such a powerful stimulant must have a real significant downside. But I've asked a million people this question, not a million, but maybe 6 people this question, some of which have written books about coffee. And I'm still yet to hear a compelling argument against having coffee in and amongst your diet, as you say, a few hours after you wake up. So one of the things that really did catch me off guard was in your book, The Genius Life, where you talk about this study with the mice and you make the case that travel has positive relationships with health. Like it has health benefits. Not something I've ever heard anybody say before, that travel is good for our health.
Yeah. Wow. I'm glad you brought that up. Because that also kind of parlays into another concept that I've been lately thinking about a lot for the first time. Well, first of all, so the study that I talk about in the second book, The Genius Life, is the fact that they, just how important novel experiences are for the brain. They will take mice and keep them confined to, like a very limited area. And they see that they suffer. They suffer in terms of their bodies and their brains. And then they let that mouse, or they let, intervention mice go and explore what they call enriched environments. And they see something like fourfold, like they see like an upregulation in various indicators of neurogenesis, which is really important. It's like the creation of new brain cells. So all that is to say, like, it's important to do novel things. And as I say this, this is something that I struggle with in my own life, because I am a creature of habit. And I would routinely get this gnawing sense that I'm living Groundhog Day over and over and over again, where I wake up and I do a few things like work related, I work out, but ultimately like I've got like this routine that I love and I tend to do that on script every day. But I started to get this feeling like I'm just like waking up, doing a few things, going back to bed, waking up, doing a few things, going back to bed. Like before I know it, like my head is just like on my pillow again. And it started to get like really frustrating to me until I discovered that Groundhog Day syndrome is actually a thing. And essentially what it is, our brains are, and this ties back to the mouse study, our brains are efficiency machines, right? It's conservation of energy. Our brains and bodies don't want to do any more work than they absolutely have to, right? Because now we know that food is like ever present, always at arm's reach, but for the longest time that wasn't the case. And our brains are massive energy consumers. Our brains speak for 25% of our basal metabolic rate, despite accounting for only 2 to 3% of our body's mass. So anything that the brain can do to make its functioning more efficient, it'll do. So when you do the same things every single day, what does your brain do? It prunes away excitement, joy, happiness. Like the dopamine response is just completely blunted. And that's why, as you get older, people universally, right? It's like a human universal. People report that time just accelerates, right? Like, where did the last decade of my life go? It's not that time accelerated, right? It's just that your life has become so routine.
It's interesting you say that because there's also the other stereotype that you get grumpy.
Yeah.
The word, yeah, it's quite typical in the stereotype that people will get older and a little bit more grumpy.
Yeah, well, they get grumpy, they get stuck in their ways, they get, I mean, yeah, that's definitely the case. But they probably are getting grumpy because their lives lack the joy and excitement that they once felt, right? Time is just like accelerating, that moving walkway that we are all on towards the inevitable decrepitude of old age, right? Like, it seems to go faster and faster and faster the older we get. But it's not because time actually is moving any faster. It's because we get so stuck in our ways. Like, our routines become so cemented. And what we fail to realize, and hopefully this, me saying this, like, shakes people out of their comfort zones, and inspires people to shake things up a little bit. This Groundhog Day syndrome, it causes our brains to just like shear away for the sake of efficiency. I mean, it's got good intentions, right? But it shears away like all the joy. So you just become like this rote automaton. And the joy, the excitement, it's just, it's something that like you cease to experience, you cease to experience it. Whereas when you look back at like your youth, for example, it's not that like time actually moved slower. It's that every day was different. And so that, I think, is really important. And yeah, we should challenge ourselves, whether it's to travel. I mean, travel is like, to me, the epitome of exposing oneself to an enriched environment because everything is new. But if you can't travel, like, go to a different gym every once in a while. Look, try shopping in different supermarkets, or change up your wardrobe, or take on a new creative project, like start a new hobby. There are all kinds of things that you could do to shake yourself out of this like perpetual routine that I think has a real cognitive and health cost.
So I was looking at a study they did on rats and habits. You probably know the study with the rats, the chocolate and the maze.
I think so.
Where they get the rats to run through a maze to a piece of chocolate. But the first time the rat runs through the maze to the chocolate, they monitor the rat's brain, and there's a ton of cognitive activity, right? You see the rat observationally scratching around, sniffing around. Eventually it finds the chocolate, it gets the reward. When they put the rat back into the maze for the second time, cognitive activity's gone, because a habit has been formed. So as I looked at the brain scans of those rats, it was just completely flat because they were on autopilot. Again, the brain is conserving its need to function so that it can focus on other things, other threats. It can conserve energy, as you say. And that's what our lives become. Like, when we get out of bed in the morning, our route from the bed to the kitchen is not one that requires me to have any sort of cognitive activation. I fly, and therefore also I don't remember the journey.
Yeah.
I just fly down there.
Yeah, you're on autopilot.
Yeah. And our lives become autopilot. And it's interesting. I'm trying to figure out, as you were talking there, like you said, shearing away the happiness. Why does being on autopilot cost me happiness? And why does it make did you say it made my brain smaller?
Not smaller.
Okay, thank you.
Well, it probably, I mean, if... that mouse study holds true in humans, it probably doesn't. It doesn't support neuroplasticity.
Yeah. There's no need for my brain to.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's an efficiency machine after all. So
The happiness point, though, why does living a life on autopilot have an impact on my happiness?
well, there are probably, I mean, there are definitely benefits to routine, right?
Mm.
Like there are not to like some of the benefits to routine can be that you have your, for example, your diet dialed in, or you have you have great connections in your community, So I'm not telling everybody to like throw their lives into upheaval, but it's just like when we start to do the same things every day, it's the scientific term is habituation.
Yeah, I've heard, yeah.
We habituate, right? It becomes habit, right? And we feel this way, like we see this with that car that we've pined for, and suddenly it's sitting in our driveway. And yeah, it's exciting for the first month or 2 months or 3 months. But after a certain point, that level of excitement that we once felt towards that car, or maybe even maybe sometimes it's the person that we're sharing our beds with, like this is just an inevitability, an unfortunate inevitability of the human condition. And so I think there are ways to hack it. I think there are ways to, travel with your significant other, or break the routine with your significant other, or, invest in things that have emotional value for you, for example. So, I mean, the car might have not been the best example, because like some people do have emotional connections with cars. Like I bought a guitar, recently that I love, and I have an emotional connection to it because it was played by one of my favorite artists,
So are you talking about that really, it's the decline of meaning that is associated with habituation?
Yeah.
So, and that makes us unhappy because as, creatures of meaning, we do need things to remain meaningful in our lives.
Yeah. It's these like rote routine behaviors that are not all that productive or meaningful. Those are, it's like driving the same route to work every day, shopping in the same supermarket every day, eating the same foods every day. Like challenge your preferences, like there are foods today that I enjoy that I didn't like 15 years ago. And I'm always willing to challenge like my own preferences about things. But it's like when you do the same things every day, you tend to start to overlook them. It's difficult, if not impossible, to maintain an appreciative relationship with something that's always there.
It's funny. It reminded me of a study I was reading about regarding music, and how there's almost an optimal point with a song that we love where it can be repeated over and over again. So say if we're listening to a hit on the radio, it's repeated, say we listen to it 50 times. There's a point where we've heard it so many times and it's become habituated that we love it at an optimal level. And then it declines when we've heard it too much, because it loses that sense of meaning. And I just remember reflecting on that, how the record industry want to put things in our lives that have a certain level of familiarity, but not too much familiarity, because then we'll dislike it. This is why they do remixes, because there's a level of familiarity there. So we like it, but it has that novel nature, which we also really value, to make us interested.
Yeah.
Which habituation obviously kills. Like habituation and novelness are inversely,
Yeah. No, it's true. It's there's this quote that I love. I'm a huge James Bond fan. We were talking a little bit about before we started rolling, but like in the latest film, there's this wonderful Jack London quote at the end of the film that they use to kind of commemorate Bond, and the quote is something like, "I shall not waste my days trying to prolong them. I shall use my time." And I love that line so much, and I think it's such a good it's so emblematic for, I think, the life that we all deserve, that we all ought to be living. I think like occasionally in this conversation about how do we live longer, like that's a nuance that gets lost. It's not just about living longer. It's about living more fully. And so, yeah, I think that's part of it, it's like breaking the routine and like getting back some of that joy and excitement that we have about life. Maybe after listening to this, it'll be, going to the supermarket and loading up on healthful food, blueberries and avocado and dark leafy greens and grass-fed beef, things like that. Or maybe signing up for a new gym membership and sustaining that because of what you now know it does for mental health, exercise. So
it's a balancing act, as you kind of alluded to earlier on, between familiarity, community, comforts, and those kinds of things, but keeping your foot one step outside of your zone of comfort. So you have the like stimulation and the joy and the spontaneity of life at the same time. And that's like a constant subjective balancing act that we're all trying to, like where I like my comforts, but there is, as you say, the comfort crisis. I can get a little bit too comfort and that will have adverse effects on a lot of things. Yeah.
And that's one of the things that I challenge with in this life is like, I love my routine and I love comfort and I love, but I also, I love travel. I'm not good at planning travel, and I, have all these like hang-ups. What if I'm not able to like find a gym that I want to go to in this new place, or find a healthy, supermarket or something to shop at? Like, these are all the things that my neurotic brain is like, okay, maybe we should just stay put, but whenever I get like pushed to do those kinds of things, like to travel, I never regret it,
You said something earlier when you were talking about habituation, about the person lying next to you in bed.
Yeah.
That was a brave thing to say.
Yeah. Well, I'm, maybe that's why I'm single. I don't know. I think that that's a common human struggle, and I've struggled with that in relationships in the past, and it's a
getting bored of someone.
Yeah, just like not necessarily getting bored, but like taking what's always around for granted. I think that happens to all of us. It's a big problem. It's a big, sad, unfortunate, awful thing that our brains do, like there's an evolutionary reason for it. And again, it's conservation of energy. So, like it's not, I think like it occurs for an adaptive purpose, but I think it's one of these things that can become malignant if we're not like aware of it. And we don't actually make an effort in our lives to challenge it, to challenge that tendency that we all have, So I'm not endorsing that. I'm not saying that there is any, reduction in value for somebody or something that we are like, that's always around. That's certainly not the case. But yeah, it's a constant fight. It's a constant battle. I think everybody experiences this.
Are you hoping to find one person and settle down with them for the rest of your life?
I am, yeah. You
crossed your arms there.
What did my body language just say?
Looked like a shield.
Oh man, yeah. Well, I've had a therapist like for the past year and a half, and I'm trying to like, kind of like unravel some of my own like, early childhood like drama that like I think has led to a more avoidant attachment style, and has given me challenges with regard to commitment and things like that in relationships. And yeah, but I'm also very lucky in the sense that like I feel like I have a very rich life. Like I have a very close family. I've got a great community of friends. I love what I do for work. Thankfully, I feel very fulfilled by my work, and so it's not like a major priority for me. But I would like to like be in I do want to call that in, like that is like something that is a goal for me. But yeah, we all have like our stuff, and I feel like for me, it's like I was incredibly close to my mom. Like that was like we talked about that. I was incredibly close to my mom. I loved my mom. It was so hard to see what she went through, and that was an incredibly traumatic experience, but that kind of like attachment that I have had from childhood to my mom, it's made it like difficult. And, some of the things that I witnessed in their relationship, my mom's relationship with my dad and their marriage, and how bad that was at times, some of the things that I saw, it didn't really set me up, to like have the easiest time in relationships. But yeah, I'm like working through it. I think therapy is wonderful. I mean, I've had a great therapist. I'm doing all the work. I'm like reading all the books and things like that.
Have you been able to identify, because I can relate to many things you said about like learning the model of love as being a imprisoning one or a toxic one or an unsafe thing, like learning from our parents at a young age that like love is unsafe, it is violent, or it is this or whatever. Have you been able to identify through therapy what your sort of limiting beliefs are as it relates to like love and relationships? Have you gotten there?
Oh man. I mean that I think the limiting beliefs that like, that you can't have the kind of relationship that you want, that you don't, maybe deserve the relationship that you want. I mean, this is a totally different like rabbit hole, but for me, like one of the things that I learned about in therapy is that when you're really, my mom divulged things about my parents' relationship to me that she, probably shouldn't have at a young age. My mom was the best mom, just to be clear, but nobody's perfect and we all make mistakes. And I think that like she probably shared some stuff with me about her relationship that she shouldn't have at the age that I was, essentially making me a surrogate partner back when she didn't have the emotional shoulder of my dad, when my dad was not being the best partner to my mom. And there's a term for it. The term sounds worse than it is, but the term is covert incest. So it's not sexual, but it's like they make you their emotional partner in a way when they shouldn't. And that's something that like at the time you feel like you're receiving really privileged information. You're like, your mom's confiding in you, and that's how I felt when I was like growing up. And yeah, she didn't really have support from my dad, and it was sad looking back. I'm not blaming her or anything. Her mother was kind of a cold woman also. So she like unloaded some stuff on me when I was a child frequently actually. And so that like, it created like a very strong attachment to her, but it has kind of like disallowed me, at least this is like, and I don't want this to become a limiting belief for me, but like the insight that I think has been like helpful to just like kind of understand where my patterns come from is that that's created a difficulty for me attaching emotionally to like other like women. And I'm getting like better. I've gotten better, but it's just a very fascinating thing because we tend to think about like childhood trauma as being like big T trauma, like I was sexually abused or something like that, which, I had a wonderful childhood. I never would have used the T word to describe anything that happened to me in my childhood. But then there's like, nobody escapes childhood social injury free. We all have trauma, whether it's like we're not picked up at the right time or we're, ignored at the wrong time or what have you. And so nobody escapes childhood trauma free is what I've learned. And so those traumas, it's like a butterfly effect. They have a way of creeping out, in ways that are not often obvious when we're adults and they affect our relationships in sometimes profound ways. And so, for me, like why, I feel like in many ways I'm a very sensitive guy. I relate to women. I love, women. I've had relationships with women. Where is this like this disconnect? And I also had a relationship with one woman for a very long time. It was an on and off again relationship, and I loved her. And the feeling was mutual, but I wasn't able to commit to her. And so, it kind of inspired this like journey of investigation, like where, if I've got like everything seemingly so figured out, how come I don't have that figured out? Like, where's the deficit coming from? Like where's the nutrient like deficit, with regard to like my relationships. And yeah, so maybe, that's it. I saw a really brilliant therapist, and I highly recommend for men, and women, for everybody should like go see therapy. It's been really helpful. The key, I guess, is to not let that become like this perpetual, like limiting thing, and to continue to do the work and to like unravel and to keep peeling back the layers of the onion. All super helpful.
We have a closing tradition on this podcast where the last guest asks a question for the next guest, not knowing who they're asking it for. And the question that has been left for you is, this is quite an interesting one. I actually really like this question because it's very interesting and slightly bizarre, but I love it. If you could summarize your journey so far in life into one I am affirmation, what would it be and why?
Whoa. So a previous guest came up with that question for me.
100%. They didn't know that it was for you.
Yeah.
But they left it knowing that it was for the next guest.
Whoa. I am love. How hippie is that? I feel like everything I do is really out of love. And so that is how I would answer that, even though it sounds so hippie that it also kind of makes me throw up a little inside.
Where does that come from?
I don't know. It's a little too like that sensation. It feels so, it feels too self-aggrandizing, and I'm not that way, you know, like I'm, I feel like I'm, you know, I can be self-deprecating, like to a fault, you know, like I like the fact that like anybody pays attention to my work, you know, it's like, it's such a gift to me. I'm so grateful for it, you know? But everything I do, like out of love, like, you know, I started doing this out of the love that I had for my mom. It continues both for the love that I have for her, but also for the love for what I'm doing and for the research and how much I love nutrition science, as well as for how much I love generally people and how much I want to see people thrive. And so, yeah, it really has been a powerful compass for me, you know, as I navigate this crazy thing called life. Love really has been it's been a really reliable North Star, you know, for me.
Max, thank you. Thank you so much. You've taught me so much, but your story is incredible. And, you know, I have absolutely no doubt, not only that, you know, your mum got to see you on that show, but also that she is just fucking insanely proud of you. Insanely proud of you for everything you've done, for all the people you've helped with these New York Times best-selling books. But it's not just the information you're sharing. It's how you share it. Not least in an engaging way. Not least because you seem to be so incredibly humble. But there's a real sincerity behind your message that I having sat here a long time, having spoken to a lot of people, don't always see. But I see that at the very heart of you. And to be fair, someone that didn't qualify in terms of getting like a medical degree or whatever would have to be driven by a pretty deep, sincere sense of curiosity and mission to go as far as you have and to sound way more articulate and educated on subject matter that people with great academic backgrounds in the field have. So thank you. And, you know, I have a real sense that you're just at the start of your journey.
Wow.
I really do mean that. I really feel like you're just at the start.
Oh, man.
And that's just a testament of how far you're clearly going to go. So, yeah, thank you for your time. Thank you for being here. And thank you for the generosity of everything you've shared.
Thank you, Stephen. I feel like you're a brother at this point.
Yeah,
So,
it tends to happen when I have conversations with people here.
thank you, brother.
Thank you, Max. Quick word from one of our sponsors. I've got a tip for all of you that will make your virtual meeting experiences, I think, 10 times better. As some of you may know by now, Blue Jeans by Verizon offers seamless, high-quality video conferencing. But the reason why I use Blue Jeans versus other video conferencing tools is because of immersion. Their tools make you feel more connected to the employees or customers you're trying to engage with. And now, they're launching one of their biggest feature enhancements to impact virtual events so far called Blue Jeans Studio. I actually used it the other day. I did a virtual event using the studio, which I think about 700 of you came to. TV level production quality, all done by one person with very little technical experience on a laptop. So if you've got an event coming up and you're thinking about doing it virtually, check out Blue Jean Studio now. Let me know what you think, because I genuinely believe, I know this is an advert and I'm supposed to say this, but I genuinely believe it's the best tool I've seen for doing really immersive, simple but high quality production virtual events. You know, I never really usually pick the chocolate flavored Huels. My favorite are the banana flavor. I love the salted caramel flavor. But recently, I think I in part blame Jack in my team, who's obsessed with the chocolate flavour Huels. I've started drinking the chocolate flavour Huels for the first time, and I absolutely love them. My life means that I sometimes disregard my diet, and it's funny, that's part of the reason why I've had a lot of guests on this podcast recently that talk about diet and health and those kinds of things, because I am trying to make an active effort to be more healthy, to lose a little bit of weight as well, but to be more healthy. And the role that Huel plays in my life is it means that in those moments where sometimes I might reach for, you know, junk foods, having an option that is nutritionally complete, that is high in fiber, that is incredibly high in protein, that has all the vitamins and minerals that my body needs, within arm's reach, that I can consume on the go, is where Huel has been a game changer for me. You got to the end of this podcast. Whenever someone gets to the end of this podcast, I feel like I owe them a greater debt of gratitude, because that means you listened to the whole thing. And hopefully that suggests that you enjoyed it. If you are at the end and you enjoyed this podcast, could you do me a little bit of a favor and hit that subscribe button? That's one of the clearest indicators we have that this episode was a good episode. And we look at that on all of the episodes to see which episodes generated the most subscribers. Thank you so much, and I'll see you again next time.